Let's go ahead and get started then with the stories. So, story this week we're going to talk about the flood myth, right? And so I'm sure probably the most common one you guys have heard of is like Noah and the story from the Bible, Noah and the flood and the ark. But actually, in researching this, like there are hundreds of flood myths from like all over the world. Like it's one of these universal myths from almost every culture has this myth about floods, right? And an interesting thing too is like most of the stories are very, very similar, right? So very similar to Noah and the Ark. The basic story is there's a regular guy, lives in a life, has a family he loves, has a job he likes, he's got a regular life. And all of a sudden someday God comes or some being comes and says, hey Noah, hey guy, I know you're like have a great life and everything, but there's a big problem. Like there's this flood coming and you're going to die and your family's going to die and everyone you love and everyone you care about is going to die unless you do something about it, right? And so you have to build an ark, you have to build a boat, you have to, there's different myths have different things they had to do. They had to do something to prepare for the flood to save themselves. And the other thing that's really common about these stories is that not only do they have to save themselves, they have to save other people or other beings, right? So they have to save their family, friends, community. And Noah and the Ark, it's you have to save two animals from every species on the planet, right? So there's not just this part of the story that's save yourself. It's also save other people, right? And then in the story, the character Noah or the other person in the story, they do it, right? They do the work. They build the boat. They build the ark. They prepare for the flood. And then when it comes, they're saved and everyone else is destroyed, all right? So that's the basic gist of the story, of the myth. And I think this was one of those universal stories, right? So the interesting thing about these stories, right, is, these are tens of thousands, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 years old or more. Like these stories started originally as verbal stories. And I think we can all kind of tell, like, based on human history, how they probably came about. And one of the really good examples of this is in China. So 4,000 years ago in China, there was this enormous flood of the Yellow River, right? This massive river in China. And the flood is one of the kind of floods that only happens like every 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. It's an enormous flood. So like cities were completely wiped out and destroyed. There were whole areas that were just flooded for weeks or months or even years. So it was a massive, astronomical, apocalyptic flood at the time, right? And so the interesting thing about that account of that flood and that flood story is that's the time that they already had writing, right? So it was like kind of modern history at that point. And so in their stories, they wrote down, who the ruler was and what they tried to do about the floods and why they thought the floods came. And so there's some there's gods in that story too. And there's other kind of beings. And so it's not 100% just a historical document. But the interesting thing is that like these other stories that are, so that was what happened in that culture in that time. Like there was a giant flood and they wrote down the story and they told people about the story and future generations heard about it. But they had, at that time they had writing, right? So when the original flood stories happened, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago, before there was any writing, the only way they could communicate these stories was through speaking, right? And so think about something like, let's imagine like 40,000 years ago, there's this giant flood, seas get wiped out, and the people who live talk about it and share about it, right? And so the story we have, like Noah in the Bible, and these other stories, these are stories that were passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation, right? And so think about like 10,000, like just imagine a flood 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 years is 500 generations, right? That's 500 generations. So imagine like listening to a story today that like, it wasn't your grandparent that started the story. It was like your 500th grandparent started that story, right? And then if you've ever played like a game of telephone, right? It's like you go around in a circle and you talk like, someone says a word and then like, you go to like 10 people and like the word they say at the end is not nearly the word they say at the beginning, right? But the really interesting thing about these flood myths that are, ancient flood myths is that the stories still make a ton of sense, right? Like the stories are still really like you can tell it's not like a detailed historical account like in China, right? They're not talking about, day one, what happened in day two and day three, etc. But what happened, what was left of those stories are the important parts, right? The important pieces, the crucial elements, the archetypal elements that apply to all of us. And that's why I like to share about these stories, because they apply to all of us and we can learn some huge lessons from them, right? And so here's the first thing that about the story is that there's a flood coming, right? And there's a flood coming for all of us, right? Like that's just life, right? At some point, we're going to get sick, or someone we love is going to get sick, or a catastrophe is going to happen. Someone we love will die. We'll die eventually, right? Like life is, these are the truths of life. And we all have to deal with some very painful, tragic events in life, right? That's just a part of living. And so what the story is saying is that all of us, we need to be prepared for the flood, right? Like it's not just Noah, it's us, it's me, it's you, it's all of us. We need to be prepared. The other thing that I found so interesting about these stories is that in most of these stories, like it's the same common theme of God comes and warns this person, right? God says, hey, there's a flood coming, you better prepare for it. And I think, I'm thinking back to like ancient people in ancient times, and I'm thinking, like, what is it like to like live 50,000 years ago when there's no writing and there's no society and there's no culture? And like, imagine like the first human being who like has a mind, right? Just imagine like the first human being all of a sudden one day like has this voice in his head is like, you better not steal that fruit from your neighbor, right? Like you better not do that thing. Like just imagine the first person like with a conscience or with like that voice in your head like telling you what to do and not to do, right? And just, right? And so, and I think for me, what I have this idea in the story is that like maybe God is like us. Maybe God is like our conscience, right? Maybe there's like a metaphor for that, because I know there's so many times in my life when I've had this voice in my head is like, you better not do that. And then if I didn't quite listen to that voice and I did it anyways, I was often very disappointed with the results, right? Like when you break your conscience or you do something you know is not right, and maybe not right away, but eventually you realize that was the wrong thing to do and you kind of pay for that, right? And so I think, all of us, we have that conscience, we have that voice in our head, we have that inner guidance, that inner knowing, right? And you can call it your, whatever you want, but I think we all know a lot of times, like what's the right thing to do and what's not the right thing to do. And we all kind of know like if something bad could happen, and we can't predict everything, right? We can't predict everything, but I think if you look at your life honestly, you'll see there's a lot of areas of your life where you can see where there's danger, right? You can see where there's a threat. You can see where if you did something, if you took some action, if you became prepared, you could really make your life and the life of those around you so much better, right? So there's this, there's this thing in writing called Deus ex machina, and what it means is basically God comes from the machine, and in Latin. But what it really means is like when you're writing a story, it's like, you have the hero in some situation and like he's stuck, and like there's no real way to get the character out of the situation without like something crazy, like God coming in and changing the picture, and then he gets saved, right? So it's kind of like this absurd way of writing a story where it's not really realistic, right? The thing with the flood stories, it's not like that at all, right? It's not like God comes and like saves Noah and then everything's good. It's like God comes and warns Noah, and Noah has to do the work, right? It's like man has to do the work to prepare. Man has to do the work to protect. And I don't just mean men, I just mean humanity, right? Like as a human being. And so I think it's the story is telling us is like it's our duty to be prepared, right? It's our duty to be prepared, not just for ourselves, but for our family, for our community, for the world. This other common, right, there's this guy, Joseph Campbell, did a lot of research around stories, and he studied like all the myths and all the stories and religious texts from all around the world. And he found something called the hero's journey, which is kind of this like archetypal story and how this archetypal story works. And one of the messages from his work wasn't just that, this is how stories tend to work, but this is what stories mean about humans, and that we are all heroes on our journey, right? We are all of us are heroes, and we all share this common journey in life. And I think part of that journey is being prepared, right? And is being prepared for tragedy and being prepared for suffering and being prepared for bad things to happen. And, there's another flood that happened recently in the United States. So when I was in college, there was a Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And it was a very big storm. And long story short, the city got flooded. Many people died. Many people were, a lot of suffering happened from that storm. And basically what happened was that the dikes that were supposed to protect the city had not been built properly, right? And the money that was supposed to go to fix the dams and to make sure they're working properly was basically wasted and squandered, and lots of people died because of that, right? So there's two ways to look at it. Like you can say like, a hurricane came and God did it and it's not our fault. But if you really look at a situation, I think you can say like, yeah, there's a hurricane, some bad stuff happened, but humans caused most of those deaths, right? It was the lack of preparedness. It was the lack of diligence in the jobs of people who were supposed to make the better and protect the people, right? And I think there's a lot of areas of life that are like that, right? It's like, yeah, there's going to be earthquakes, and there's going to be in the Philippines typhoons, and there's going to be all kinds of bad things that happen in life, and we can't control that. Like, we're not God. We can't control the universe. We can't control everything that happens. But we can do our best to be prepared when bad things happen. We can do our best to be prepared to protect ourselves and to protect our community and our family and the world, right? And that's what the story's about. So here's the other thing about the story is like, the flood is coming, but like God doesn't tell him when, right? And he doesn't tell him how, right? And it's like conspicuously left out of that story, right? It's like why don't, God knows everything. Why doesn't he just tell him when it's coming and how it's coming? And we don't get all those details, right? And I think that's also kind of how life works. Like, we know something's coming. We don't really know when, we don't really know how. But if we do our best and we become prepared, we can withstand it. And I think the other message about the story, which I was trying to make the point before with the hero's journey, is like, we are all the heroes in that journey. And I think we are all Noah. We are all the leader of the story. We are all the person who can save the world, right? And maybe it sounds corny to you, but I think that's true. It's like you can save yourself. You can save your family, right? And I think it's really easy for you to just look at like, what if you just quit your job and sat on the couch all day for like 5 years and didn't do anything? How would your family do, right? And probably your family would do a lot worse, right? So we all know that there's things we could do to make our life and our family's life and our community's life way worse, right? And even just things like we could just avoid doing just make their life worse, right? And so obviously that's not what we want to do. We want to make life better for ourselves and for our family and people we care about, right? And I think the story is telling us is that one of the best ways to do that is to be prepared, right? Is to see things coming. One of my mentors, Jim Rohn, said, ignorance is not bliss, right? Ignorance is not bliss. Just because you don't know something's coming, just because you're not aware, just because you're not paying attention, it's not going to make you happy. It's not going to make you successful, right? So, and there's a lot of people who live their life and they don't want to talk about, getting sick or death or things that are tragic or things that are painful, right? They just want to avoid it and pretend like it doesn't exist. And so they don't prepare, right? And the reason they don't prepare is because they don't want to face that, right? They don't want to face that emotional pain, that emotional conflict. And I think that's why a lot of people avoid things in their life, right? Because we don't want to face that. But what the story is saying, and I think the important thing to do is to say, look, you have to face the truth, right? You have to face the truth that some bad things are coming for you. And that's just how life is. But you're strong enough, you're smart enough, you're wise enough, you can build the ark, you can build a boat, you can save yourself, you can save your family, and you can save the world. And that's what I think the story is about. And I really believe that. And I believe all of you have that power. And I think we should not take it for granted, right? Like every day you put off building your boat and becoming prepared is another day wasted, another day squandered, and another day closer to disaster, right? So what I want to do now is all let's do a writing exercise together. And because I think all of us can kind of see the flood coming in our own life. And if we spend time thinking about it, maybe we can be more prepared and protect ourselves and our family and the people we care about, right? So the first question in the writing exercise, and it's in the agenda if you guys are new, is what kind of flood do you see coming, right? For your life, for your family, for the company, for, any area of your life. What kind of floods do you see? What kind of dangers do you see coming? And here's the thing is like, humans are really good at seeing danger. like we can like predict disaster and like the most mundane thing, like, oh, if I walk across the street, maybe I'll get hit by a car. It's like, you don't want to be like neurotic about it, right? Where you're just afraid of everything in life. But you want to just kind of like honestly look at your life and say, where are some areas where I better be a little bit more prepared? I better look out and see if there's something there. And here's the thing is like, if you predict a bad thing happening and you become prepared and it doesn't happen, you're good, right? Like there's no problem. Like there's no, right? It's like this old thing is like, if you save money and you don't spend it, the worst case scenario is you have money to spend later, right? Like there's nothing, like you're not going to get hurt by being prepared, right? It's the not being prepared when you need to be that is really what's dangerous in life. And then, like, so how could you prevent the floods that you see coming? And are you prepared? Like, are you doing your best to become prepared? And what else could you do to become prepared? So let's